The alluvial fan was a really popular spot in Rocky Mountain National Park. My parents live a few miles from there in the town of Estes Park, Colorado, and it was one of the places they always loved to take visitors because it's beautiful, and most of all, it was really easy to maneuver for people of all ages and abilities. It had a lovely paved path and lots of bridges that allowed you to get on the rocks and see the water. An alluvial fan is caused when flowing water goes through a narrow passage and picks up loose sediment and carries it along until it hits an open path. And the open plain allows the water to slow down and spread out, leaving a deposit of sediment that kind of looks like a fan. The alluvial fan in Rocky Mountain National Park was created in 1982 when a dam broke and caused a major flood. And in 1985, the Park Service paved the path and built bridges and trails, and it became a beautiful spot for people to encounter nature. In 2013, there was a huge flood in Larimer County where Rocky Mountain National Park is located. Lots of rain came in really fast, and it drastically changed the course of the rivers in the area. Homes were lost. Highways had to be rebuilt because they were washed away as the rain came down and the rivers swelled. Among the huge changes to the landscape of the area was that the water carried tons and tons of rocks from higher up on the mountain down and completely destroyed the trails and paths and bridges at the alluvial fan. I mean, it wiped out trails, it took out bridges, it wiped out the trailhead parking lot and part of the street leading up to it. In some places, rocks filled in under bridges, making it impossible for water to flow underneath them. In the course of a few days, the alluvial fan went from a must-see spot for family pictures and a great place to take your sweet great aunt from the Midwest or your favorite toddler for a picnic to, well, kind of a pile of mud and rocks. And I know that 1982, when it was formed, until 2013, when it was washed away, is not really that long. Certainly not long at all in the history of the Rocky Mountains, like not even the blink of an eye, less than the blink of an eye. And maybe it doesn't seem like all that long in some of your lives either, but for me, that's my whole life. For my entire life, I could count on going and visiting that part of the park and having paths to walk on and bridges to play on. It formed my connection with that place. It was how I experienced and interacted with the nature there. Those bridges and paths, they were so much a part of that place for me that it hardly even occurred to me that they weren't really a part of the nature that surrounded them, that they helped us experience that landscape, helped us navigate it, made it easier and more accessible to us, helped us to connect. But they weren't really ever going to be a lasting, permanent part of that place. The expanse of its existence was so much bigger and more complicated than those impermanent structures, no matter how much we had come to rely on them. And the thing is, each of us, all of us, have expectations about the way our lives will look, what it means to be who we are, what the landscape of our lives will be like. As we navigate the terrain of our lives, we build bridges and paths that help us to connect with God, that help us to connect with people, that help people to connect with us. And sometimes those bridges and paths seem so solid, so necessary, have been there for so long that we come to imagine them as permanent fixtures, part of the landscape, impossible to live without. Maybe it is the relationships with family or friends or partners. Maybe it is our closely held beliefs about politics or how people should behave or what our community is supposed to look like. Maybe it's the story we tell about ourselves or the stories we tell to ourselves. I assume that for many of us watching this right now, church is one of those paths that we've built in our lives. And by church, I mean our faith, certainly, but also the rituals and experiences of being part of church, the name on the building, the hymns we sing, the Lord's Prayer, that walk into the building from the parking lot, the person who greets us as we come in the door, the pew we sit in, all of it is part of the path we've built that helps us experience God, helps us to connect to God. And maybe it sounds silly, but it's actually really natural. It's part of how we are made. Except that those paths and bridges, no matter how solid they seem, no matter how permanent they feel, the expanse of our lives is bigger and more complicated than the bridges and pathways we build. And so inevitably, those bridges and pathways stop working for us. Sometimes through the normal course of growing and changing, we discover that we veered off the path we started on and new paths have to be forged, or we come to a stream and we need to build a new bridge to connect us with whatever is on the other side. And sometimes hard, sudden, devastating things happen that wipe out the road from underneath us or rearrange the landscape so we hardly recognize it or take out the bridges we've come to rely on. And those experiences can be really painful and heartbreaking. Sometimes the landscape of our lives will never again look the way we wish it did, the way we're used to it looking, or the way we want it to be. But look closely at that picture of the bridge where the rocks filled in the space where the water was supposed to run. Now look over to the right of that bridge. Do you see what's happening there? How the water has found a new path to take. This, to me, is where hope lies, where joy lies. That even when the things we've counted on change, when the bridges and paths that have helped us navigate our lives get taken away or stop working for us, the Spirit still finds a way to work in our lives. The Spirit still moves in us and through us, makes new pathways and offers us new opportunities to build new bridges, to connect in different ways. The key is trusting in that promise, being willing to offer our lives to that promise, being willing to let go of the bridges and paths in order to join Christ in building new ones. This week, several pastors from Billings and I were talking with Paul Nixon. He's a ministry coach who works with churches who are navigating change in the lives of their communities. One of the ways that Paul and his colleagues measure the readiness of churches for change involves a survey of the congregation that gets put in a computer and generated into a handy-dandy report, and churches receive a score based on their answers to the survey. Paul was sharing with us his experiences with the church that has scored the lowest of all the churches that have ever taken that survey, and the church that scored the highest. The lowest scoring church was a pretty straight down the middle First United Methodist Church in a mid-sized town in the Midwest, a middle-class congregation, mostly white folks, mostly middle-aged and older. And they were just stuck in the way they'd always been. The highest scoring church was a predominantly Latino church on the southwestern border. It was a newer congregation that leaned more toward the Pentecostal side of the Methodist continuum. The people in that church, Paul said, it felt like if God was asking them to sell everything and do ministry in a new place, they would do it in a heartbeat. The thing Paul said that really struck me was that in his experience across all the churches he'd worked with, it seemed that the more comfortable the people in the church were, the closer to middle class, the more homogenous their life experiences, the less likely they were to be ready to try something new or to even know how to listen and discern if God was trying to invite them to try something new. That the more comfortable they were, the less likely they were to risk even a little bit of that comfort. But the poorer, the closer to the edge the people in the church were, the less they had, the more likely they were to risk all of it in order to go where they felt God was leading. He said United Methodist churches are often built for comfort, not for change. Paul the Apostle told the Corinthians that when all else fails, when everything else has fallen away, 3 things remain: faith, hope, and love. He told the Philippians that the way to find joy in a world that was changing, the way to build community in the midst of all the challenges and compromises and difficulties that presents, is to live in accordance with the mind of Christ. To hold loosely to the impermanent things we want to cling to, our preferences, our privileges, the way we've always been, and instead to hold tightly to the things that are permanent, the faith, hope, and love that flow from the trust in God's promises. That little church in the Midwest, that small middle-class church that was stuck, the story that Paul Nixon told was that as they began to think in new ways, as they began to take small steps, they began to see change. They began to get unstuck. The more that they trusted and the less they clung, the more God began to build bridges and pathways in their life and connect them with the community around them. The river will continue to flow. The water will find a way. The Spirit will move in us, through us, and within us. It is our job to trust in God. Would you pray with me? And as we turn our hearts to God, I invite you to close your hands tightly. Make your hands into a tight fist. God of wild rivers and untamed nature, an unruly universe, we want to hold so tightly to the things that feel safe, to the things that feel comfortable, to the things that feel familiar. You have created us to build pathways and bridges in our lives, to rely on familiarity and ritual. Yet this world is unpredictable, and your call is always challenging. Help us to loosen our grip on our preferences, on our privilege, on the way things have always been, so that we may find open hands to receive your call. As you're ready, open your hands. God, we are open. We want you to lead us. Help us to follow where you go. Amen.